Hello, welcome to Temple University Japan campus. Order out there. We're extremely happy to have Jacques Hymans with us, who's done a lot of work on Japanese nuclear policy, both why Japan chose not to develop a military nuclear program, and also he's worked a lot on the civilian nuclear energy program, and he's now at Tokyo University until the end of the summer, and afterwards we'll go back to University of Southern California, where he's a professor. So thanks again, Jacques, for taking the time to brief us. He'll speak for about half an hour as usual, and then we'll have our usual Q&A. I also would like to bring your attention to his Achieving Nuclear Ambitions, Scientists, Politicians, and Proliferation from Cambridge University Press. We're going to circulate order forms if you'd like to order the book. It's kind of required if you want to be allowed out of the building, but there's no pressure. And it's only $1,000, right, for the pass. It's a pretty good deal. Just a few things. If you have a mobile phone, you can put it on vibrate. If you're not on our regular email list, you can give us your business card either to Walter, to Madeline, to me. And also, if you'd like to contribute to our programs, we have our ballot box out there, which is our contribution box. Once we got 12,000 yen. On Wednesday, we got total contributions of 191 yen. So we will see if you manage to break the record one way or the other. We hope it's going to be on the upside rather than win. If you manage to give only 190, we'll be also very impressed. So thanks again, Jacques. Floor is yours.
Thank you. And we'll turn off maybe the
Thanks, Robert. Just a brief word about the book. The book is actually about a totally different subject than what I'm going to be speaking about this evening. The book asks the question of why, since about the 1970s, the pace of nuclear weapons programs that were launched has slowed down in comparison to the pace of programs during the 1950s and 1960s. We normally would think that with the acceleration of technical progress, there would be an acceleration in the amount, in the efficiency of nuclear weapons projects. But in fact, we've seen the opposite. And so the book attempts to understand that puzzle, looking at cases from China and Iraq, Argentina, Yugoslavia, and then some of the recent cases like North Korea, which is very much in the news this week. So that's the last thing I'll talk about, nuclear weapons. And now I will talk about my current research project, which is on the nuclear policy review process in Japan that was launched by the terrible accident at Fukushima. I should mention, I'm glad that Robert told me that I have 30 minutes to speak, and then we will have about an hour for questions, and I'm very glad for that, because I hope that I'm here as much to learn from you and to listen to your opinions and views as I am to give a lecture. This is a work in progress, and so and of course the whole issue of nuclear power in Japan is a work in progress, and so I certainly would not view what I'm telling you here as the God's truth. So if you point out failures or other areas in which I haven't done my work well enough, I'll be entirely grateful for your help, and I have plenty of time, as Robert mentioned, until the end of the summer. I have plenty of time to do a better job than I've done up until now. So with those preliminaries, I'll start, give you what I have learned. So as you all know, on March 11th, a year ago, there was this terrible accident at the nuclear facility at Fukushima, involving 4 explosions at 4 different reactors there and 3 partial core meltdowns. And as you probably all also know, in the aftermath of this terrible accident, a number of countries around the world, particularly in Europe, decided on some pretty substantial changes in their national nuclear policies. So Germany is the most famous of these. The German government enacted an 180-degree reversal in their nuclear policy within just a few months of Fukushima, and decided that they would go to zero. The German decision was followed by a decision in Switzerland to do more or less the same thing. In Italy, there was a plan by the government to start a major nuclear power program, and a referendum had been scheduled long before the accident to take place, as it happened, just a few days after the accident. And 94% of the Italian voters voted against the nuclear power restart in Italy. So Italy failed to launch a nuclear power program. And Belgium also made a decision quite similar to the decision of Germany and the decision of Switzerland. So these were quite consequential policy shifts by significant democratic developed countries. And so one might assume that since Fukushima was very far away from Europe, but very close to Tokyo, that the policy shift in Tokyo would have been every bit as dramatic. But in fact, the policy shift has been reasonably slow in coming. It's still not entirely sure what Fukushima will cause in the Japanese nuclear policy. But so far, the change has been quite modest in comparison to those other countries. So I hope this will take me far enough. Yeah, so when we think about Japanese nuclear policy, we can think about 5 basic areas. Nuclear exports, the nuclear fuel cycle, nuclear power for electricity, and nuclear safety. And then the 5th category would be nuclear weapons. Of course, the Japanese policy on nuclear weapons is not to have them. You probably can't read this, but I'm going to spend a lot of time on this slide, so don't worry if you can't read it. I'll basically be able to walk you through everything that is written up here. The policy, so looking at this middle column here, the policy of Japan on nuclear, civil nuclear, as of March 11th, 2011, was pretty much the same policy that had existed in Japan ever since the 1950s. The Japanese nuclear policy is a really remarkable example of resilience in very different political circumstances, in very different economic circumstances, very different circumstances for the sort of reputation of nuclear power. Despite all sorts of shocks and problems over the years, Japanese nuclear policy has remained substantially similar for a half-century. This is really quite remarkable. The main change, actually, over the past century, half-century, is right up top. Up until relatively recently, Japan did not have a major nuclear export program, and that has gradually arisen over the past couple decades. As of March 11th, 2011, nuclear exports was a principal pillar of the DPJ's economic revitalization strategy. And this was not just talk. Toshiba, for instance, had purchased Westinghouse from British Nuclear Fuels. It's actually an American-based nuclear company for something on the order of $4 billion. This was a very serious investment that really placed Toshiba alongside Areva, the French company, at the very pinnacle of the worldwide nuclear industry. So nuclear exports, as of March 11th, 2011, there was a big push underway. I'll just jump down here and then I'll go back to the nuclear fuel cycle. As far as nuclear power plants, the policy in Japan as of March 11th, 2011 was to try to increase the reliance on nuclear energy from the current level, I say current, I mean as of March 11th, 2011, of about 30% of domestic electricity supply up to about 50% of domestic production by 2030. So this was a national policy. Wasn't for sure that that policy would be achieved, but certainly this was the formal policy of the Japanese government to raise the reliance on nuclear power from 30 to 50%. Nuclear safety, the policy was to issue 30-year licenses at the beginning of the lifetime of a nuclear power plant, and then when the 30 years was up, as long as the operator could demonstrate that they were conforming to the various safety regulations, they would be able to receive, in theory, unlimited 10-year extensions. So each 10 years, they would have to go through the process again of proving that the plants were safe. In Europe, it had become common to have computerized so-called stress tests for extreme events, and in Japan there were not any of such stress tests. The nuclear safety regulations in Japan, like much of nuclear policy in Japan, had been relatively slow to change over the years, and this issue of the stress tests was one instance of that lack of change. The nuclear safety regulation was a joint task of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry on the front lines, the famous now Hwan-in, and then behind that, as a kind of a backstop, the Nuclear Safety Commission, which was supposed to double-check the work of the Hwan-in, or the NISA, as it's also known. As for the nuclear fuel cycle, this is an issue that had been very hot as an international issue for a long time. Japan is one of the few countries in the world without nuclear weapons to be fervently pursuing the complete nuclear fuel cycle. And many non-proliferation advocates, since basically forever, have suspected that Japan's pursuit of the nuclear fuel cycle was part of some type of nuclear weapons hedging exercise. I argue in an article in International Security that came out in the fall of 2011 that that's an incorrect interpretation, but anyway, it's certainly the case that Japan was very much pursuing a nuclear fuel cycle, and in particular, there was an effort underway to bring this very large fuel reprocessing plant at Rokashomura up and running. Fuel reprocessing is important because you're able to take the used fuel that was in the power plants before and extract plutonium from it, which then theoretically you could use to fuel further electricity production. And in fact, Japan had been blending some plutonium along with enriched uranium to fuel nuclear power plants here. But actually the production of plutonium was a lot larger than the amount that was being used in the nuclear power plants. Also, there's this issue of the fast breeder reactor, which was again a very long-standing goal of the Japanese to try to use plutonium fuel in this fast breeder, which actually produces more plutonium than it uses. And so this is the great dream of the 1950s and 1960s of an unlimited power supply. That if you're actually producing power and yet also producing more fuel than you're using, then you could have electricity that's too cheap to meter. So this was an idea that had been pursued by many countries over the years. One by one, those countries had abandoned that pursuit. The other country that still has been holding the true faith, if you want to put it that way, has been France. But Manju was certainly a core element of long-term Japanese nuclear policy. And then also there's a domestic enrichment of uranium, so moving from the raw uranium up to a low-enriched uranium that could be used as fuel for the light water power plants that Japan has focused on. So that was the situation as of March 11, 2011. Now if we fast forward 1 year, the question would be, well, how much has changed? This policy had lasted a long time, but Fukushima was a tremendous shock, and because of that tremendous shock, countries far away, like Germany, actually reconsidered some of their basic policy orientation. How much did Japan change? Well, I've already told you, I think it didn't change all that much, at least not within the first year. So the nuclear export drive has gone on completely unchanged from before. Actually, the Diet, since Fukushima, ratified nuclear cooperation agreements with Jordan, Russia, South Korea, and Vietnam, and started nuclear cooperation agreement negotiations with a number of other countries. I noticed in the papers that they've recently completed a kind of preliminary agreement with Turkey. So these nuclear cooperation agreements are basically setting the groundwork for an eventual specific nuclear export. So this has gone on completely as if Fukushima never happened. The fuel cycle has run into a little bit of rough waters as a result of the accident, but not a very rapid change. The reprocessing policy is unchanged as of now. The enrichment, they tried to restart Rokasho in January of 2012, and then they had a little sort of mishap, and this is an old story. They've had 18 years of mishaps, basically, with Rokasho. They're still trying to get it right. And so when they once again had this mishap in January, they had to stop it. They're going to have to clean things up and try again. So right now Rokasho is not operating, but that's not because they've made some sort of a great policy change. It's just because Rokasho has never operated. The enrichment plant was restarted on March 9th, 2012. So that's actually operating again. That had been shut down in 2010, actually, because of some problems. They finally fixed the problems and got them up and running on March 9th of 2012. Manju was hit. They did take a hit in their budget of about 25%, which means that although there was the intention to start Manju up this year, that won't happen. They don't have, all they have is the budget to continue some sort of keeping it warm, but they can't actually really launch it. Initially there was a plan that the DPJ had cooked to cut the Manju budget by 80%, and then it was rolled back to just a cut of 25%. If they'd cut it by 80%, essentially they would have been cutting that out. They would have been essentially saying, we're dropping Manju, but they didn't do that. So this is a significant budget cut, but basically just putting something on ice for a year, and they're going to revisit it in the following budget. For nuclear power, this is the area where the apparent change has been the greatest. So before March 11th, 2011, there was this expectation of an increase in reliance on nuclear power from 30% to 50% of domestic production. And in the summer of 2011, there was a document produced by a council of ministers called the Energy and Environment Council, which stated that the policy of Japan will be to decrease reliance on nuclear power. So that made a lot of headlines. Japan is going to decrease its reliance on nuclear power. But when you actually read the document, what it suggests is that they're going to decrease the reliance on nuclear power from the 50% that they had expected to reach by 2030. So the plan is not necessarily to decrease reliance on nuclear power from the amount that was being produced as of March 11th, 2011. The plan is to decrease the amount below what they had hoped to produce as of 2030. So theoretically, by 2030, Japan could be producing 45% of its electricity with nuclear, and this would be permissible under this new policy. Now, I've read in the papers that METI is considering a number of different percentages, ranging basically from, they threw in 0%, but they're not serious about that, so 20% to 30% basically is the range that's being talked about. So they aren't talking about 45%. But this is all still up in the air. What is clear is that the policy change used this word decrease, but what ordinary people would understand as a decrease is not what they meant when they used the word decrease. They were contemplating potentially even an increase. As for nuclear safety, there have been some changes, in particular throwing out the old 30-year license system with 10-year extensions and putting in sort of the international standard, which is a 40-year system with one 20-year extension. At first they were contemplating not having the 20-year extension, then the 20-year extension came back. So really, would you prefer to be in a regime that's 30-10-10-10 or 40-20? Actually, I think a lot of nuclear power operators are quite happy with the new regime of 40-20. Then they have introduced the mandatory stress tests, so that is a change. Once again, kind of moving Japan toward the international standards in the nuclear safety area. And they announced this plan to migrate the nuclear safety bureaucracy over from METI and the NSC, the sort of double-hatted system, over to the Ministry of Environment. That's actually run into trouble in the Diet, and the LDP is saying that the DPJ's plan doesn't take nuclear safety seriously enough, which is kind of an interesting political play there by the LDP. So we don't really know, but theoretically anyway, this Ministry of Environment is going to take over nuclear safety. What that will mean for nuclear safety standards, though, remains to be seen. And it's quite plausible to imagine that there will be a shift of the label of who is doing the regulating, but you will have essentially the same people with the same attitudes and even with the same ministerial affiliation, because the people at METI were going to be sent over to the Ministry of Environment to do this safety regulation, but most of them would probably end up going back to METI. And so the Ministry of Environment would likely become a kind of colony of METI in the similar way that the old Science and Technology Agency was a colony of METI in the 1960s. So there has been a lot of change, but most of this change has not focused on the fundamental pillars of Japanese nuclear policy. And this is pretty interesting for a social scientist because you think that institutions are pretty resilient, but when you have gigantic shocks to those institutions, you expect some change. So what might explain the resilience of Japanese nuclear policy even against a shock as big as this? Well, I argued in that international security article that I mentioned before, and I'm going to argue again in this new case, that the real obstacle to reform in Japanese nuclear policy is institutional. And in particular, in political science, we have a concept of the veto player, which is a pretty easy concept to understand. Essentially, the idea is if the president can veto a bill, then the president has power to shape the content of that bill. But in Japan, it's not just the president or the prime minister in the Japanese case that has veto power over nuclear policy. There are an enormous number of different institutions that have effective veto power over radical nuclear policy shifts. And this has happened as a historical process gradually over time. So in the 1960s, you could see 3 veto players in the Japanese nuclear policy making arena. In the 70s, that rose to 4. In the 90s, that rose to 5. In the 2000s, that rose to 6. If the Ministry of Environment ends up becoming a serious power in the nuclear policy-making field, then that will rise to 7. And the more veto players that you have, it's sort of a iron law of political science, if you want to put it that way. The more veto players that you have in a policy-making arena, the harder it is to bring about substantial change in the policy in that area. So as Japan has had an increasing number of veto players, it has also been encasing its nuclear policy that it started in the 50s, it's basically encasing its feet in cement. I divide these into 2 main types of veto players. Major veto players who basically they can blink at something and it's gone, or minor veto players who have to scream really hard to stop it, but if they do that, then they can stop a major policy shift. And just for reasons of time, I won't go into all of the nature of these veto players, but the major veto players are the electrical utilities, METI, and the cabinet. And it's possible that the Ministry of Environment could become another major veto player if it actually got the power that it was promised. And then in addition, you have minor veto players, including the Atomic Energy Commission, which has the statutory right, actually, to set Japanese long-term nuclear policy. The heavy manufacturers and prefectural governors, at least those governors that have major nuclear facilities operating on their territories. The governors are a little bit different kind of veto player. They don't have significant power over formal Japanese nuclear policy, but they have a lot of power over nuclear policy implementation. Because if they don't agree that the facilities on their territories are safe, then the facilities can't run. So you have 6 veto players, all with different interests, all trying to use their veto power to get a better deal, either inside the nuclear arena or on some side issue that they think they can leverage their power over nuclear policy to obtain some benefits in some other area. And as a result of this, what you have in Japan is 50 years of nuclear policy stability, or stasis, and even after Fukushima, very, very difficult road to reform. I'm just going to move quickly through these slides. There is a reform process underway, don't get me wrong. It's not that the game is lost somehow. There's a tremendous amount of effort being put into reviewing every aspect of Japanese nuclear policy now. And it's possible that some of those efforts are going to lead to some substantial policy changes. I find it quite remarkable that it has taken Japan this long, and we still haven't seen those remarkable policy changes. And I think that as time goes on, the chances of remarkable policy changes may diminish. Nevertheless, I don't want to underestimate the fact that there are a lot of people working very hard and producing a lot of ideas about how to shift various aspects of Japanese nuclear policy. I'll just move to this slide quickly. So one of these policy review committees is being organized by the Atomic Energy Commission. And the Atomic Energy Commission has recruited a certain number of people who are considered to be anti-nuclear, and basically in the nuclear policymaking sphere, everybody knows if you're pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. It's not a difficult gray area sort of issue. So the anti-nuclear members of this committee, this was a committee that was already undertaking a nuclear policy review prior to 3/11/2011. And then it stopped for a while, and then it picked up in the fall of 2011. So prior to the accident, the anti-nuclear members of the committee were taking up about 10.5% of the total airtime. So how much time were different people speaking? Pro-nuclear voices were speaking 90% of the time, and anti-nuclear voices were speaking 10% of the time. After the accident, that changed a little bit. So the anti-nuclear people doubled their volubility. They started talking a lot more. And yet, even now, they're taking up 20% of the airtime, and the pro-nuclear are taking up 80% of the airtime. So there has been a shift. It's probably not the kind of shift that you would expect to lead this committee to completely overturn its prior beliefs and to go for some radically different policy. I should say, however, that I think that this anti-nuclear versus pro-nuclear split in Japan has been somehow overdrawn because, as I mentioned previously, what I think is really important for understanding Japanese nuclear policy is not that you have pro-nuclear people out there versus anti-nuclear, but rather that you have different organizations with very distinct interests that have a lot of power over nuclear policy and a lot of difficulty coordinating with each other to come up with a policy that everybody believes is better than the one that they had previously. So this multiple veto players model, I think, is a much more powerful way of describing Japanese nuclear policymaking than the typical pro-nuclear versus anti-nuclear model that so many people tend to use. I just want to end with, well, maybe I should go back. So far this talk has been entirely on the national policy level, or almost entirely. But real life in Japan is not only at the national policy level. And nuclear policy could be changed substantially even if national policy doesn't change at all. One way in which nuclear policy could change substantially is if you have substantial changes at the corporate level or at the prefectural level. And so just very briefly, there is a major question right now about the future of TEPCO in particular, and about the future of the electrical power companies in general. They can't get financing. And as a result of the fact that they are in a tremendous cash crunch, not only being unable to get financing, but unable to use their nuclear power plants, the government is basically being in a position of nationalizing the electrical utilities. If this were to happen, that would lead to a real considerable change in the dynamics of the Japanese nuclear policy arena. One of the core veto players would be eliminated. And this could have all number of effects on Japanese nuclear policy, but it might not actually change the general orientation of Japan toward a pro-nuclear direction. Because if TEPCO gets taken over by METI, then METI is going to have more power, and METI is the champion of the traditional nuclear policy in Japan. And I know I'm running very short on time, so I'll just very briefly put up the last slide, which is to point out that prefectures also have a lot of power in Japan, and the veto player issue could become even more complicated if it is accepted that you don't only have to get the governor's approval in the territory where your nuclear plant is located, but you also have to get the approval of the governors in the surrounding prefectures who might be affected in the event of a major nuclear accident. So there's a lot uncertain, and we still don't know how things will turn out, but I've tried my best to summarize the broad lines of the nuclear policy debate as I see it, and I'm very interested to hear your questions and your suggestions for my further research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques. This is fascinating. I think your conclusion, I was looking at today's front page of Asahi, and yesterday also the governor as well as the mayor of Osaka, two different individuals, at least as of still now, are asking that they be given basically a veto on the opening of any nuclear power plant that's within 100 kilometers. And obviously given the size of Japan, its geography, if you have a 100-kilometer veto zone, you end up having a rather large expansion of veto players, because it's not like you're in the middle of Montana. Now, just if you have a question, Madeline, you're going to circulate the mic. So raise your hand, or both hands, or three hands, and you'll be given the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Chris. I'm from Waseda University. I wonder whether you could elaborate on the table.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah. You quickly showed the table with the veto players, the majors and the minors, but you didn't have time to elaborate on the others.
Right.
So I wonder whether you could do that and explain, for instance, why you listed USA there.
Right. Right. So the nuclear policymaking arena in Japan certainly involves many people who do not have a formal veto over a policy decision. So those 6 players that I've listed on the left-hand side, the minor veto players and the major veto players, actually in some direct way can themselves block the other 5 from moving ahead if they choose to do so. The other veto player, or the other players are not veto players, but they may have a lot of influence. The United States certainly was a veto player in the Japanese nuclear policymaking arena up until the 1970s, let's say. And the United States was very clear, for instance, about the idea that Japan could not have nuclear weapons. The United States also was very clear about the idea for a long time that Japan could not reprocess. But as Japan increased its economic strength, and as the United States ran into some troubles, Vietnam and so forth, the United States started being unable to prevent Japan from going for reprocessing. And there was an agreement at the time of Jimmy Carter's administration that basically gave Japan the green light to reprocess, which was actually at the very same moment that Carter had launched a global campaign against reprocessing. So you get a sense of how that veto that the Americans had once wielded over Japanese nuclear policy really had vanished. However, the Americans are still very much involved, and in fact got even more involved in Japanese nuclear policy since this accident. As you probably know, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission took this very seriously and sent a team over here which basically stayed in Japan for about an entire year, working closely with the Japanese, in particular on reformulating the nuclear safety area. And that's one reason why you see the Japanese moving toward the international norms of nuclear safety in the last year. There's a lot of American pressure and a lot of American advice, but this is not to be confused with veto power. If the Japanese had said, no, we're completely uninterested in moving to the international standard, then the Americans would have just had to go home with their tail between their legs. But because the Japanese did show some openness on that, the Americans were able to make their case and to try to move that ball a little bit. Other non-veto players, like public opinion or the Ministry of Education, for instance, the universities, all of these people matter for the ultimate outcome of nuclear policy, but they matter less when the chips are down than institutions that have some type of formal or direct control over nuclear as, significant, sort of the core of nuclear policy.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I understand the view of the political science, but if you think of the economics in Japan, the answer is completely different. If you shut down the old nuclear power station, first of all in Kansai area, that means that you have to shut down a lot of the manufacturing facilities and lose a lot of the employment. Hospital and transportation, that's one point. And the second point is if you shut down the old nuclear power station, then maybe the import increase around 2 or 3 trillion yen for the new fuel. And when Japan in 1980 or 1990, it was possible, but Japan's strength is going down so rapidly that impossible, And also the cost will increase around 2 trillion yen. That means someone should share that cost, First of all, it's impossible for the manufacturing companies from the viewpoint of the competition. And third, if you shut down the old nuclear power station, maybe the employment for maintenance of the nuclear power station, that will lose around 5 to 10,000 people. That's not a big problem, maybe. And so it's impossible. Okay, and maybe you say why Germany can do. In short term, they can import the electricity from France. That's a short term. For long term, some shine or power station will be installed in Sunbelt. In case of Europe, that's in the North Africa or in Spain. But in case of Japan, there is no Sunbelt in this area. That will be in Australia or the desert in China. So the United States and also maybe the EU can abolish the all nuclear power station. But in case of Japan, it's impossible, at least for 10 or maybe 20 years. Do you think so? Or how do you evaluate that kind of the factor?
Right.
And if you shut down the nuclear power station means, Japan will be Greece. Very fine.
Okay, certainly one of the arguments for maintaining nuclear power stations is precisely what you just, the argument you made. And as a political scientist, I'm very reticent to embrace, basically the argument is a functionalist argument. So, as a political argument, that's a great argument, right? But for political science, what we notice is that even though things are impossible or stupid, they happen all the time. And so the question is, for us, is not, why didn't this obvious truth, why wasn't this respected, but what's the balance of forces? And in Japan, you had somebody who was actually pretty important, Prime Minister Kan, who essentially decided that he thought that Japan's 50-year nuclear policy had been a mistake. And he pushed with all of his might to change that. He failed. So the question is, why did he fail? If he had been the President of the United States, with the power of the presidency of the United States at his disposal, he probably wouldn't have failed. But he was the Prime Minister of Japan. And the Prime Minister of Japan, in particular in the nuclear area, has not that much power. And therefore, that's where I'm focusing on, is this large congeries of veto players, all of which have their own interests, that are able to slap down one of those when he decides he wants to take the country in a radically different direction. This happened also in the 1960s with respect to the question of Japanese nuclear weapons. The Atomic Energy Commission was asked repeatedly by the prime ministers, not every prime minister, but certain prime ministers, asked repeatedly to launch research into nuclear weapons. And the Atomic Energy Commission vetoed that. So these kinds of radical shifts away from the traditional policy are very difficult to implement in Japan because of the very complicated multiple veto player structure.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. My question is about the nuclear veto players. When you say veto players, do you mean the legal veto power, or is it more of an influence? Not just the legal. The reason why I ask that question, if you mean veto power, not in legal sense, I just wonder we could add like a business association like a K-Rank, because they are very, very influential and they're very supportive of nuclear electric power companies. And then my next question is how, if it's not legal, it's very difficult because to change it because it is intangible. Then what would you say can influence that kind of intangible power?
Yeah, thank you. I've tried to go as close as I can to the definition of veto players, in this case that's based on legal powers. I stretched it a little bit in particular for the heavy manufacturers, because the heavy manufacturers, in essence, without the heavy manufacturers you could never build anything in the nuclear area. So if the heavy manufacturers decided we're not in the nuclear business anymore, then you'd be in a lot of trouble if you wanted to build something. Or if you wanted to unbuild something, because it's actually harder to decommission a nuclear power plant than it is to put one up. So that's the one exception. But in the other cases, actually, these institutions have a tremendous amount of formal decision-making power, including the electrical utilities. They're private companies, but the electrical utilities actually own almost all of Japan's nuclear estate, and so they have ability to deal with their own property the way that any private company has to deal with its property. And this actually was an issue. Again, I'm referring back to my previous article on the question of Japanese nuclear weapons possibility, but the private companies in 1967 took the plutonium away from the state, essentially. They had the plutonium, but the state had always claimed that any plutonium produced in Japanese reactors, even if it was private reactor, the plutonium was the property of the state of Japan. But in 1967, the private companies were able to overturn that regulation and to claim the plutonium, as their property, rather than the property of the state. And so if it's the property of the Japanese company, in this case TEPCO or KEPCO or what have you, then it's much more difficult for the state to grab a hold of that plutonium and to use it for some purpose that is not in line with the company's interests, for instance, nuclear weapons. So these veto players are they actually have some formal way of blocking radical nuclear policy changes, whereas an institution like the Keidanren, which I certainly agree I could have put up on the right-hand side of that chart, but it would be alongside the public opinion, for instance, as certainly a constraint, certainly something that pushes politicians or pushes other institutions this way or that way. But when the chips are down, in the end, not an institution that can itself make nuclear policy.
Scott Foster from BNP Paribas. First of all, I think your model for understanding the decision-making or not-making process is excellent, extremely useful. But I'm wondering about the difference between in principle and in practice, which is often quite great in Japan in many different areas. In principle, they haven't changed very much, but in practice, almost all their nuclear power plants are shut down. How many nuclear power plants are still operating in Germany? And the next, so I'd like to hear your comments on that. And then I'm also interested in why we should benchmark against Germany, which is a very extreme case. Why don't we benchmark against the United States and Russia and China, much bigger countries. In the case of Russia and America, they had their own accidents, and they haven't shut everything down. So the benchmarking issue, what do you measure it against? And then finally, can you put the map of the seizing distribution back up so we can worry ourselves to death?
Was that a joke? Okay. Well, actually, they're related. Right. So I ran out of time basically at the end. I wanted to talk about this issue of in principle versus in practice. It's a very important thing. I mean, it's important to note that Japan used to have 54, now it has 51 nuclear power plants, and one of them now currently is in operation. So that's a huge, difference in a year. Actually, the reason why, or at least part of the reason why you actually have that change is the institutions that existed prior to 2011. So the governors, and that's why I decided to leave this slide up here, but the governors, as I mentioned, have to agree for any nuclear power plant to start up. It's not a central government, it is a central government decision, but it's also a decision of the governors in which the nuclear power plants are located. And so up until 2011, it was actually, there were long and drawn-out negotiations with governors already, because the governors were in part genuinely concerned about the risk of nuclear safety, and in part because governors were using this as a leverage to extract significant side payments from Tokyo for a whole range of economic development goals that they had in their prefectures. And now the governors are sitting pretty because they have a much more credible threat available to them that they will not allow the plants to restart unless the central government gives them really, as you know, a great treasure in in exchange. So it's absolutely right that this is why I mentioned at the end, and I'm sorry I had to rush that part, that you could have complete lack of change at the level of national policy in a completely different situation on the ground. Now, what's happening right now is that the central government has decided that they want the lights to be on in the summer, and so they're throwing everything that they have into trying to get the governors to go along with the restart. And the first test case is going on right now at the OE reactors in Fukui. If they can get those, they've already gone through the stress tests, they've already passed all of the government tests, the central government tests, and if they can get the Fukui governor to sign on to the restart there, they believe that the rest of the reactors are going to be turned on kind of like a positive falling domino effect. But this is being challenged by neighboring governors, as Robert mentioned, in particular the governor of Osaka, now the mayor of Osaka, who quite reasonably state that the Fukushima accident didn't just affect Fukushima. It affected the neighboring prefectures in a major way, not only in terms of the cesium spread and the iodine spread, but also just in terms of public impression that somehow anything that comes from Tohoku is going to be glowing green at night. So, so if in fact these neighboring governors are able to win this battle and to expand the nuclear safety agreement from what previously had been simply a matter of one governor and one electric power company to 3 governors and 1 electric power company, then it's very possible that, in fact, it'll take years before you see any nuclear power plants restarting in Japan, even if the policy of the national government is to restart them all. Oh, benchmarking, I'm sorry, great questions. So just quickly on benchmarking, so the idea, you're absolutely right that you could compare Japan to South Korea, which hasn't blinked an eye about the future of its nuclear work. The idea of Germany is simply that it should have affected Japan more because it happened here. And yet the actual policy change, it's not that the policy has, the government has reaffirmed the policy as they did in South Korea and moved on in life. They're still in the middle of this policy review process. And really what I'm trying to point out is the reasons for the slowness of coming to a conclusion, rather than trying to argue that it's obvious that Japan should have gone the Germany route and it somehow is curious that they didn't. What's obvious to me from an outsider, if you don't know anything about the internal structure of policymaking here, what would be obvious is that you would have some kind of major national discussion leading to a major new national direction. And that hasn't happened. We just have a long-standing, ongoing discussion that may be petering out, may be leading somewhere, but it's very complicated because of the many different puzzle pieces involved.
Hi, Jacques. I'd like to push you on 2 points. The first, you probably are anticipating, is the veto player's argument. To some extent, strictly speaking, there's a circularity in your argument. METI is not, in the George Sevelis framework, a veto player. In a parliamentary system, if the let's get rid of nukes today party were to win big, it wouldn't, but if it did, in principle, they could put in a new METI ministry and completely change policy. Now, that wouldn't happen, but we need to know why. In other words, to some extent, you've got a circular argument. They're veto players because they're veto players. And why are they veto players? We have to look at a whole lot of other politics. So from a strictly institutional point of view, you're trying to make a slightly more parsimonious argument than is really theoretically speaking, completely sustainable. And that's true of the electric utilities too. As you pointed out, financially they're extremely weak. They've also incurred the hatred of everybody in Japan. So if some new party came in and said, we're gonna really show you who's boss, in principle they could do that. Now you might say, or practically everybody else in the room might say, well they can't in reality, and that's true, but then we need to understand what that reality is. And I don't think just looking at the number of veto players, the way you've done that is quite sufficient. It's not like the kind of cabinet in Europe argument that Sebelius originally made. And as you also know, because I've told you before, I think without looking at the ideological distance among players, you don't have a really robust argument. In principle, you could have 100 actors, but if they all completely agree, then there would be no problem in changing policy. Or you could have just 2 actors, but if they completely disagree, then they could stymie policy change. So in the original theoretical framework, both number and distance matter. You've talked today only about number, and I can only say, Jacques, I told you, you've got to talk about distance. That leads to another question. So what's the distance? What determines the ideological distance? And that comes down to, as you well know, security and cost. And as was just pointed out, there's tremendous concern that Japan is isolated, that it has very few alternatives, and that the alternatives are much more expensive. That means in the next 10 to 20 years, there's not much Japan can do. But I think that leads to another policy question, which we perhaps glided over a little bit too quickly. In your 5-part picture, the one that's changed the most is nuclear power, where you admit there has been some change. But there's a kind of categorical distinction. Restarting plants is relatively cheap. They've been depreciated. The money's been spent. So the power produced from them is very inexpensive at this point, at least in terms of some cost. Whereas to build a new nuclear power plant is prohibitively expensive. If you look at the US, Canada, or Europe, where you have pipeline gas, they're absolutely, completely uncompetitive. Now you could argue Japan is different because it's LNG and because the structure of the market is different. In the short run, that's true. But the LNG process itself doesn't really cost that much. Liquefying, deliquefying doesn't cost that much. Transportation costs aren't that high. The real problem is the structure of the market, and now the US, Canada, Australia, Indonesia, Qatar, and other people are hell-bent for leather to sell natural gas to Japan. So it seems to me that if you don't make a distinction between restarting plants, which to some extent is highly likely, and building new plants, which I would argue is highly unlikely because natural gas will be too cheap, and political opposition will be high, and if we talk about a 20 or 30-year time frame, renewables will become more useful. So I think if you don't take into account these background factors, which I know you know very well, but you really push for the parsimony, I think for my case you pushed too hard. You lost some of the kind of the motivating politics behind it.
Yeah, sure. Those are great comments, of course. So the original veto player model in the very political sciencey term of the sense of the word model was, as he rightly notes, about parliamentary parties, essentially. And what I've done is I've extended that to, I believe that it is inappropriate to focus only on parliamentary parties when it comes to Asian developmental states. I think we have to recognize that maybe we're just singing from the same hymnal here, but that Asian developmental states do not work according to the sort of neat way that George Sebelius portrayed parliamentary systems as working. And so we have to recognize that METI, there's a political figure on top of METI, right? And theoretically, the minister of METI has to be listened to by the rest of METI. But historically, that is sometimes not what happened. METI is actually, right, as Chalmers Johnson pointed out so well, right, METI is not only a post-war phenomenon. It actually has its institutional roots in a totally different political regime here. So that's an indication that we are dealing here with an institution with a tremendous amount of staying power, and that we can't simply argue that it's going to change when some new party comes into power with a different idea. However, I admit that in theory, the Diet does have control over state policy, and so in theory, yes, you could have these veto points to be brushed away in the event of some kind of major catastrophe. But I think the Fukushima catastrophe demonstrates that if that theoretical possibility were really realistic, it should have happened with this catastrophe. And the fact that it didn't, the fact that you even had a prime minister who wanted to make it happen. You had a prime minister who tried to go around, I showed those different institutional review process committees, such as the AEC committee, and there are two major advisory committees to METI that are doing their work. Prime Minister Khan tried to get around all of that. He set up this new Energy and Environment Council, which was a bunch of ministers, but the intention was then to produce an organization underneath those ministers to create a new energy policy for Japan, completely bypassing METI and completely bypassing the Atomic Energy Commission when it came to nuclear policy. And essentially over the summer months and into the fall, and particularly after the fall of Khan, but even while Khan was still around, you could see that that Energy and Environment Council was gradually losing steam, and the traditional veto players of the nuclear policy-making arena were reasserting themselves. So that the policy review process now doesn't look all that different from policy review processes in past years, except that there's a lot more attention. And why is that? Because the politicians gave it their level best effort to try to change the way things worked, and they ran up against the fact that they had already alienated a tremendous amount of their power to other actors, and they couldn't just take it back when they decided that they wanted to. As for ideological distance, yes, or just the general idea of distance between interests, absolutely. If these different veto players all perceived themselves to have the same interests, then they wouldn't have any difficulty agreeing. However, these are very diverse set of veto players with very different sense of what is best for them, and therefore the problem is very acute.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Just a small question on the government structure of Japan. There's a new nuclear power safety commission or agency has been decided to be placed under the jurisdiction of Environment Ministry. My question is, would it be relevant in the light of achieving the, re-strengthened nuclear safety regulation? My personal opinion is that it might be much better to put this agency completely independent from any ministry of the type. Thank you.
Right, so that's the debate right now going on. The DPJ wanted to push this bill through that would restructure nuclear safety regulation. Currently under METI, essentially with the Nuclear Safety Commission as the double check, they wanted to send it over to the Ministry of Environment. The LDP is arguing that, in fact, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency should have a status somewhat similar to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States, which is really quite independent of direct political control. My job isn't to tell Japan what its policy should be. So I'll just note that it's true that there is this debate. And the question really for me is, well, could the Environment Ministry actually turn into a new veto player? And I'm a little bit skeptical about that, in particular because what you're doing is you're taking an existing nuclear regulatory structure and you're moving it over to something that has been a very weak ministry up until now. So essentially, it seems to me that it's quite likely that what would happen is that rather than the Environment Ministry taking over the nuclear bureaucracy would take over the Environment Ministry. And that would occur whether or not this new situation was formally legally separate from other ministries or other political control, or whether or not you had a minister there, because as I mentioned previously with respect to METI, you know, the minister comes and goes, but the ministry remains.
Thank you for your excellent speech. There are three topics which I think are absent from the debate, and you're not alone in not mentioning them. They would be advertising, decommissioning, and local politics. One is the question that the only place I've ever seen it mentioned is in the FCCJ magazine, Foreign Correspondence Club magazine. Why is it that TEPCO is the largest corporate advertiser in Japan when they have a monopoly? And I think that if you are aware of that, then you realize that universities and public opinion really don't belong on your paper, because they own public opinion, and that's been bought. And I think that one of the things, I agree with you that no one should tell Japan how to run their policy, but an observation that should be aired has been that when somebody is a monopolist, maybe they shouldn't have the right to advertise. That's just an observation. Secondly, I don't believe that there has ever been a policy of how to decommission a nuclear power plant in Japan. And we all talk about it as if it is possible to do that. But there's actually been never a nuclear power plant ever stopped, ever decommissioned in Japan. And that's been an assumption that people know how to do that. So the safety, the long-term planning, all of that has had to be kind of ad hoc because it's not been set into policy. It's always been, as you said on the left side of your chart, that it would go on in perpetuity. And finally, about local politics. I think you made some excellent comments about Germany, but I would take a really different political approach. You have an aging prime minister. She's losing power. The Free Democrats are probably going to be a weak power. It was a fantastic political move to get the Green vote and the Green Party. And now you see the Pirates and the German. It was a wonderful pivot for domestic political reasons to help her to really shed one local coalition party and position her for the next election. So it was really more about German local politics. In the same way, I think that local politics in Japan, there is really a glass ceiling that no one must talk about between local politics and national politics. To choose one example of many, we have had as president Governor Reagan, Governor Carter, Governor Clinton, Governor Bush. Not one single prefectural governor has ever made it to national politics. And that is the threat to the ways of Nagatacho that Hashimoto Toru represents. Because for the first time, a governor might be able to move to the national stage. And that is why so many forces right now are calling him the Nazi, the Hitler. He is such a threat to the national politics. And so what you talk about in practice and in principle, the local politics are a huge threat to the vetoes. And I would suggest that the prefectural governors might be one of the strongest veto players. It's on your chart, but it's lower down than some of the other ones.
Okay, great. Well, I think, you know, TEPCO certainly has probably the worst, as someone else mentioned earlier, has probably the worst popularity of any organization in Japan right now. And I just point that out, so they may be advertising, but there's a lot of crosswinds there. Public opinion, right, is malleable, and different people try to manipulate it one way or another way, and it's often the case that the one that spends the most money gets more results than some others that are spending less money. But in general, my argument is that the commentary on Japanese nuclear policy has overstated the role of public opinion, or even the threat of public opinion, that really Japanese nuclear policy has been driven largely by the 6 veto players that I mentioned, all of which are elites, with the exception, as you mentioned, of the governors, which may be a kind of a different kind of elite, and one that may be a little bit closer to the ground, a little bit more nervous about public opinion. it might be pointed out that in the United States also, in many parts of Japan, local, when you mention the word local opinion is often pro-nuclear in the place where nuclear sites are located, because they know that that's their meal ticket. And it's the wider prefectural public opinion that is often more negative. For decommissioning, I attended a fascinating seminar at the University of Tokyo Nuclear Engineering Department in mid-March, in which a professor from Berkeley, actually who's Japanese but teaching at Berkeley, came back and told his colleagues that if we're serious that the job of nuclear engineers is to offer technical solutions to political ambitions, then we need to be serious about drawing out the technical steps that are necessary to complete a nuclear phase-out in Japan. And we haven't done that. And he was implicitly suggesting that the nuclear engineers at Todai, in particular, were somehow allowing their political opinions to get the better of their professional obligations. And as you can imagine, he got a lot of pushback from his colleagues. But it was an interesting discussion, and I think that it may well indicate that there is some sentiment on the part of at least more open-minded nuclear engineers that it's a very important issue to tackle, because, as you rightly say, a political decision to go for a nuclear phase-out will be stillborn unless there's the technical basis to carry that out. I'll just stop there.
Sam Jameson, WD Research Institute. I'd like to ask you about Son Masayoshi. He's already had an impact on promoting solar power, and recently he apparently visited Mongolia, where the Gobi Desert is located. And I saw him say on television that the winds on the Gobi Desert blow in the summer, in the winter, in rain, sun, any time of the year, and blow constantly. And if that wind power could be captured and put into some kind of a tube or tunnel running under the ocean to Japan, there would be an inexhaustible supply of energy for Japan. Obviously, that isn't going to happen. But is that a totally off-the-wall idea that has no possibility of realization?
Well, again, so he may be the other extreme from the previous question that suggested that if Japan didn't have nuclear, Japan would somehow go back to the 19th century. And I'm not a energy markets expert, and I'm not a technical expert on different energy sources. So basically, all I can say is that yes, there are these different currents in the political debate. There are those in Japan who suggest that Japan doesn't need nuclear. There are those, at least not in the long term. There are those in Japan who suggest that Japan is always going to need nuclear, even in 100 years. And from a political scientist perspective, the question is not who's right. The question is who's going to win. And it's too early to say who's going to win, but there's a lot of evidence, I think, in the past year that there's a tremendous inertial power to the answer that was selected in the 1950s and that over time became consolidated in institutions here, that nuclear was going to be the future. So the past is really determining the future to a large extent. Whether or not that's a smart way to go is for somebody else to decide.
My name is Sadaki Namada. I'm a retired ambassador. I used to be the foreign ministry spokesman. That's why I'm interested in the role of public opinion. Firstly, one brief comment. I have a feeling, having listened to you, that we can't get ourselves out of the quandary unless we resolve the question of the political leadership for the whole of Japan. So I'll ask everybody to ponder that question. My question is, you put public opinion, media, and so forth on the sideline, as it were, as one of the other players. You haven't mentioned civil society as such, although you did refer to some NGOs in passing. Is civil society forever going to be relegated to this secondary position on the sideline? Or are there any ways in which they can find their role?
I think that the best way for me to answer that actually is to go to a slide that I jumped over in my talk. Civil society certainly is not limited to anti-nuclear groups, but civil society in the form of anti-nuclear groups has gotten their foot in the door in the nuclear policy review process as a result of this accident. So if you just look at the most striking change actually is in the Advisory Committee on Natural Resources and Energy of METI. They had such a committee in 2005, 2006 that looked at the overall Japanese nuclear energy mix. This was the group that decided that Japan would reach 50% of nuclear production of electricity by 2030. And as you can see, in that committee, there were 35 members, and all of them were in favor of nuclear power. Were well known to be pro-nuclear. In this recent committee that was formed after the accident, about a third of the members are well-known anti-nuclear activists. So this is a considerable change from before. And the reason that you had this change, you can compare this to the AEC, which always had, at least since 2005, they always invited some anti-nuclear activists. After the accident, they invited one more, but they also invited 3 more pro, so in the end, the percentages were the same. So the difference between the AEC and the METI is essentially that the AEC is more independent of political control than METI. So I was sort of down on the politicians, but in fact the politicians made an impact here. The AEC gets to choose their own advisors, and they had obviously decided that it was important to have anti-nuclear people on that committee. But
excuse me, when you say advisors, permanent advisors?
No, these are
people who were called in.
These are people who are called in to work on, in this case, the long-term plan, and they work very hard for a period of about a year, looking at every aspect, and then they make a report, and the AEC finally makes the decision. So they obviously decided that they wanted some NT people, but not too many. And after the accident, they didn't change their mind. Whereas in this case, essentially, I did an interview with a METI bureaucrat who's very heavily involved in this process, and he said that the reason why they went from 0 to 8 or 9, there's one person who it's difficult to categorize, is that Minister Edano called in the bureaucrats and he said, I want very strong representation of anti-nuclear groups on this committee. And so it was done. The question of how influential they can be and how influential that committee is in general in relation to the bureaucrats is another issue. But certainly the civil society groups are much more on the inside than they ever were before. I'm not in charge.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to your nuclear experts who came home from Berkeley to confront or discuss things with the professors at Todai. After that meeting, did he go to Toshiba and MHI and Hitachi? I think that, first of all, they probably put a lot more thought into decommissioning than scholars, if only because if you're not putting them up, you probably want to be taking them down, and they've got 30 years of work ahead of them if they know how to do this. Anyway, I'm just curious if the discussions went beyond academia and into industry, and also if you know anything about it, how far along the nuclear plant builders are in developing the technology required to decommission them.
nuclear power plants?
I basically don't know the answer to those questions, I'm sorry.
My name is Sato. I just belong to the older citizen group. So older citizen will take a lead of the nuclear power policy and realization of any risk control in the future. That's my belief, based on the assumption that the comfort level of life or the economic condition in the future is definitely affected by the ceasing of the nuclear power operation. So that I think we are in the midst of the transition period. And what you're thinking about the real control of the safety is not about the nuclear power station's operation, but nuclear waste. And all these things are untouched. So I just focusing on this point, the waste control, what is going to happen in the future about Japan.
I think that's an important issue, and of course in the question and answer we've sort of focused mostly on just one of the four rows that I had in my original table. We focus almost entirely on the issue of nuclear power plants for electricity production. But one place where you might have expected more movement than you've seen is in the fuel cycle facilities, and probably the principal reason why a large number of the veto players are still fighting hard to maintain those fuel cycle facilities is because otherwise they have to reclassify the waste as waste. And when they do that, then they run into a lot of difficulties with local communities. So as long as you can say, no, it's only there temporarily on your property, and it's going to eventually move over to become fuel for another cycle of nuclear power production, it's much easier to do the politics on the local level than when you say it's waste and it's going to sit there forever. So the waste issue is absolutely umbilically tied to the fuel cycle issue. And one of the questions that I went to the anti-nuclear group, the Citizens Nuclear Information Center, Dr. Bond in particular, interviewed him, and I said, why don't you drop your opposition to waste, finding a permanent waste site, because if you do that, then the justification for the fuel cycle is going to vanish, and you'll have this tremendous victory. You're going to be able to stop Rokasho, you'll stop Manju, you'll do all of this. And he said, well, I understand what you're saying, but you know, in the anti-nuclear community, a lot of us are all or nothing. And so that is a real sort of dilemma that, as I mentioned, you have this big gap. It's not difficult to identify people as pro or anti-nuclear because they're on one side or they're on the other side, and the number of moderates in this field is really very small.
Would you like to say a few concluding words, or? Okay. Thank you very much, Jacques. This was fascinating.